Hello and welcome to the final presentation in our Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office 2023 speaker series, Hidden Oklahoma. I'm Christina Wyckoff, the historical archaeologist here at the Oklahoma SHPO. And in this series, we've invited archaeologists working in the state to discuss important archaeological sites they've investigated and to demonstrate why archaeology is critical to our understanding of our past. Today, I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Richard Drass. Dr. Drass is an archaeologist emeritus with the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, and he has extensive experience documenting and investigating pre-contact and early historic archaeological sites in Oklahoma. His
Thank you.
presentation is, sorry, Early Wichita Sites and Fortifications in Oklahoma, and I'll hand it over to you, Rich.
Thank you. I'm going to talk today about kind of a mystery for archaeologists for a long time. One of the native groups in Oklahoma that's lived here for over 1,100 years that we can at least trace back and probably much further is the Wichita. And some early historic reports indicate that they had occasionally had fortifications at site. None were known for a long time, and any earlier sites that have been excavated have not yielded any indications of fortifications. But as we'll discover today, there are a number of Wichita sites that just before and after European contact were fortified, and these were built by the Wichita for various purposes, not to defend against Europeans in some cases, but also defend against other tribes invading into the territory of Oklahoma. So before I get into the fortifications, I want to give a little background on Wichita archaeology that will lead up to us looking at the fortifications we have discovered in Oklahoma at Wichita sites. The Wichita, like I said, have an extended and long history in Oklahoma. In fact, subdivisions of the Wichita have lived in almost all areas of Oklahoma, as far west as into the Texas Panhandle, to the eastern woodlands, up into central Kansas and as far down as northern Texas. So it's a widespread group. Most of the archaeological sites we see after 1100 that are sedentary village sites can be attributed to ancestral Wichita tribes that were in Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas. About 1,000 years ago, the first agricultural groups settled in villages along the rivers and streams across Oklahoma and began to cultivate corn, beans, and squash, hunt bison, and live in permanent houses year-round. The house you see on the screen is a Wichita beehive-shaped house that doesn't appear until after about 1400 or 1450. The earlier Wichita groups were living in square to rectangular structures, usually on terraces or ridgetoes right near major streams in the rivers. They were making pottery using chert flints for tools and trading sometimes long distances across to the southwest, to the southeast, and even materials coming from as far away as Utah or Minnesota made it into Oklahoma. Around the 1400 to 1450, there's a distinct change in most of the settlements in Oklahoma, not just Oklahoma, but in the plains. And we see this move to circular roundhouses. We see consolidation of people into larger villages and fewer sites, but much bigger villages. And this can be partially attributed to some changing environmental conditions and people and other groups moving around. About that same time, around 1400, 1450, we see, for instance, Apache groups moving down into the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles on the western edge of the Wichita Range. And Osage are pressuring from the Missouri River down into as far as northeastern Oklahoma and all over the plains, this kind of movement of groups. And it probably created the need for, the initial need for some kind of defensive structures at Oklahoma, native Wichita sites. When we think of the forts that we see in Oklahoma, we usually think of Fort Gibson, Fort Wichita, Fort Towson, those kinds of forts that were part of the frontier and Indian territory in the early and mid 1800s, and may have been, some of them were used during the Civil War and even later. But this is a traditional European style fort where you have the barracks and the other buildings that are surrounded by a stockade, and they're usually square or rectangular, and they're pretty consistent like that in the U.S. Some areas of the plains have traders' forts that vary a little bit, but these are all historic forts that are generally don't appear in Oklahoma till the 1800s. So they're well into the historic period. When we look at early explorers in Oklahoma, the first European to contact Wichita tribes was Coronado in his 1541-42 expedition. He crossed, we think, in the Oklahoma Panhandle and went to visit Wichita sites in central Kansas that were grouped along streams in that area. Shortly there, not too long, I mean, not very soon after that, but not too long after, in 1601, another Spaniard was coming from New Mexico, where the Spanish were centered in Santa Fe, looking for the Wichita again. And they came through Oklahoma and found groups of Wichita along the river in the Arkansas City area, just north of the Oklahoma border. And these were typical grass thatched houses, and they were large, contiguous villages that stretched for miles along the Arkansas River and the Wood River up there. And those are probably the earliest contacts we have with Wichita groups, but they were very ephemeral. The Coronado turned around and Oñate turned around and went back to Santa Fe, and that was about it for quite a period of time. We have French interests in the east, down in Louisiana and the Missouri area in the Midwest. They come from the eastern part. They met Caddos in Oklahoma, Texas, and southeast Oklahoma and Texas, and in that area. And they ventured up there in the early 18th century, about 1719. We have contacts coming up from Louisiana and down from the Missouri River area into southeast Kansas that met Wichita groups. Those are our primary historic records that are really early. Interestingly enough, none of these mention fortifications at Wichita villages. They probably didn't see any, or if they did, they didn't note them in the records that they kept about their travels in the plains. This map also has it has a place called Ferdinandina and Longest. These were two areas of early 18th century contacts with French and down in the south with Longest. Longest is the Spanish and French. And we're going to talk about those. Those areas do have fortifications on them that we know about, but I'll get into that in a little bit. The only historic record we have of fortifications comes from Spanish and French sources, which is usually in the early to mid 1700s. And we have only a description of, the only fort we have a description of that's on a Wichita site is the fortification that was attacked by the Spanish in 1759. It's called the Longest site down on the Red River in southern Oklahoma, south central Oklahoma. Before that, there were travelers especially French, coming up the Arkansas River. They met at that place called Ferdinandina on the maps, and met the Wichita there, traded with them, and tried to go to New Mexico, and the Spanish promptly captured them and recorded all the information they had. And that they just simply described forts with poles and earth with openings in them. That's not much of a description of fortifications. Later, even, we don't get much information on fortifications, even up into the 1800s. But the one site, the Longest site, that was attacked by the Spanish, that site provides several descriptions of the fortification. Unfortunately, they're very brief, and they only give us a broad outline of what the fort looked like. They describe circular embankments with it's surrounded by a ditch on the outside. They also mention, I don't have it down here, but they mention interior subterranean structures that non-combatants and supplies were kept in. Now, this village in the longest site, this description has been in the Spanish record, of course, for a long time, and they didn't know about its location in Oklahoma or Texas or somewhere in that area, but that's the best they could do. In the 1960s, there was a significant amount of work done along the Red River on Wichita sites on the Oklahoma and Texas side. The one on the Texas side is near a town called Spanish Fort, which gives you the impression that that would be a probable place that the Spanish had a fort. But no, the Spanish never had a fort in that area. But it's likely that there was a Wichita village there, and it was a Wichita fort. So for a long time, that was the area that was thought to be the fort attacked by the Spanish in 1759. Unfortunately, the descriptions of the attack and the location don't very well match that location for the site. But there is a large Wichita village on the Oklahoma side of the river, on the north bank of the river, that's been known since the early 1900s. That site has been plowed for about 100 years, so it didn't have a visible fort on it. But we knew there was an archaeological site there, and it was investigated in the 1960s. And they found evidence of roundhouses, harsh pits, all the kinds of everyday activity. But they didn't find the fortification ditch on most of their initial work, although they did extensive work at the site. And right after the last excavations were done in 1967, the farmer deep plowed his field. And this aerial photo shows, I don't know if you can see it on there, but there's this white ring. That's about 120 meters, over 130 yards long and over 80 yards wide. And that's the area it encompasses. And it's white because most of this is plowed up bison bone that had been thrown into a ditch. And they did some text excavations along the east side of the ditch. This part of the river flows north to south. We're looking west, and the river's down in the upper part of the screen. They tested it across there, found that it's a ditch that was filled in with trash and debris and soil. And so they went back to the literature, and the consensus was this was the fort attacked by the Spanish in 1759. The Wichita and their allies, Comanche and other groups, easily repelled that Spanish attack and sent them back to the San Antonio area, and they captured two small cannons from the Spanish at that. But archaeologically, that's all that was done at this site until fairly recently. Now I'll come back with some more information on this site later in my talk, but I want to move to some earlier sites. This maps the longest site is this one. These red site numbers that we see in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas are areas where there are fortifications, or we think there are fortifications. The longest site is the one mentioned here. I'm going to talk about these two in Oklahoma on the Arkansas River and this one on the Verdigris River in Kansas later. But I want to go out west where we see two sites in west central Oklahoma. And these sites date to about the 1500s. All these on the eastern, further east, are dating in the 1700s. So we have quite a time range in terms of fortification. I should mention that the Spanish attributed to the fort at longest in their defeat to the presence of French in the fort who helped them construct this fort. And thus they were stymied by Frenchmen, but not by Wichita. We're going to find that that's not the case because the Wichita had been building similar fortifications for hundreds of years. The earliest forts, as I mentioned, are in the 1500s. There are two sites, the Duncan and Edwards I sites. Edwards I is one of the earliest investigated sites that is attributed to this period around 1500 when we see the first forts appearing. It's a large village. It actually has an earlier Wichita occupation at the same site. It's on a terrace above the North Fork of the Red River. And in 1968, they did a field school here and excavated in the village, which is to the west of the fort. And then they did some excavations in this area where they found, surprisingly, a whole bunch of bison bone coming out of ditch-like features. And they had attributed this to a ditch, possibly a fortification, but it was not confirmed in any particular way at that time. Most of this material has still not been analyzed enough to know about all of the site's activities. But the fort, interestingly enough, the fort has what we call magnetic surveys of it. It's gradiometer that surveys the magnetics in the soils in the ground, and it can tell where soils have been dug, places have burned, things like that. And in this case, it can tell where ditches have been dug and dirt piled up to form ramparts. And what you see are two different versions of the magnetometer survey they did at the fort for this in 1981. The one on the left here shows the ditch and possible soil on both sides. But when we get a closer look at this one, the black on this one is the ditch, and the ramparts where most of the dirt were thrown show up on the inside, which makes sense if you're defending to repel people easily. You have a moat type ditch, you have a ramparts, and you may have a stockade on top of it to keep the enemy out. And this one, we're lucky enough that there's an entryway through the ditch and the ramparts into the interior of the fort. This is about 50 meters, over 50 yards in diameter. It's a circular fort. And there have been, besides the excavations in 1968, there's not been any other work besides this magnetic survey on this site. But we have an earlier a site of the same time period, 1500 to 1600, in a small creek that feeds into the Wichita River in Wichita County, Oklahoma. I don't think you can see this very good, but there's a dark circular stain in the middle of this plowed field. After the field was plowed, all these fields so far you've looked at have been plowed, so the ramparts aren't there anymore. What we're going to see is primarily the ditches. This we thought was a fortification ditch. We put a trench across the east edge of it and profiled a similar moat type ditch where it's about 3 meters, about 2 to 3 meters wide, so about 2 or 3 yards wide at the top, and it narrows to about a yard wide at the bottom. So a typical moat type ditch. It's about 1 meter deep at the most, and it has plenty of bison bone in it and other debris from the occupation. The plowed field that you're seeing here is pretty much the whole site, with a little bit coming south below the road here. We went back to the site in 1984 to do some excavations. Unfortunately, we did nothing in terms of the fort, but we did excavations south of the fort and to the west of the fort, the biggest one being South Area C on this map, south of the fort. We found post molds, probably from some structures. Unfortunately, we don't know if they're round or square structures or tepees or beehive Wichita houses. There's just too many post holes, and they're not distributed in the patterns we were expecting. We did find other features. These are shallow roasting pits, and then we had rock hearths and ash-filled hearths. What we see at most of these, this is one of the roasting pits. On top of it was burned bison bone, and on top of almost all the roasting pits, these are shallow pits. They're for processing bison. We think this was a fall bison hunting camp where they went out and spent time killing bison and processing the meat there. There's a little bit more to it than that because there aren't any storage pits, deep storage pits. The structures may not have been permanent. That's why we weren't seeing good patterns for post for drying hides and posts for arbors and other activities are likely, but not the permanent Wichita houses we usually see. When we excavated it, however, one characteristic of this time period is they're doing extensive long-distance trading, and they go as far as the Pueblos in New Mexico, to the Caddos in southeast Oklahoma, northeast Texas. They got chert from north central Oklahoma and north central Texas, and materials coming long distances, showing up at this what we were calling a seasonal fall bison hunting camp. Well, it doesn't fit the bison hunting camp, but with the fortification there, it may fit the idea of a trading center. They're out there hunting bison in the fall, but they're also gathering other groups in there to them to trade with, particularly maybe at this time the Apache, who also had access to the Pueblos in the Northeast, and maybe even the Caddos from eastern Oklahoma and other Wichita groups from further east in Oklahoma were coming out into the plains, the short grass plains, to hunt bison and trade at these trade fairs. They could have been trading for bison hides and bison meat, or they could have been killing their own there. But we see pottery, we see points made out of obsidian. These are coming from these types of potsherds, and points materials are coming from New Mexico. Painted pottery, we see Caddos type wares that are coming from the east, cherts and stuff that are coming from Kay County, Oklahoma, and red pipestone that originates in Minnesota, that's traded all the way down to Oklahoma. So this particular site has given us, and the Edwards site too, has given us evidence of a different kind of activity, and associated with that are these fortifications, round circular fortifications with about 50 yards in diameter. Now we haven't done any further excavations at the site, and the drawing on the left shows the shape of the fort as we know it, and that's because on the right are the magnetics from this particular site. The top one is the complete fort, and this is the best magnetic design from a fort that we've been able to achieve. You'll see some of them later on when we look at some of the later sites, but you could tell exactly how this fort was designed. This black is the ditches. The white is probably the back dirt from some of the ditches, but this site's been plowed down for over 100 years. This is an entryway, and another entryway that is defended by a ditch and ramparts coming around the side and coming in from the east. North is up, and on the south is a third entryway. So we actually know more about this fort than many of the other forts we're going to do, although the only thing we've tested is on this outer, or it turns out to be the outer fortification ditch at this site. This, I call it an apple-shaped fort. This is not unusual. When you have entryways into fortifications, they typically need to be defended. This narrow opening, this extended, what we call a baffle, that protects this side of the fort, and intruders have to come all the way down here to enter. This could be easily blocked. When we look close at this bottom one down here, you can see two lines coming down. We think that's a stockade that extends out from that southern entrance and protected that southern entrance of the fort. So from this one scan, just going over the surface of this site, we learned quite a bit about a fort that we only had a small test into. There's some activity going inside here, but there's not enough. There's a lot of metal in here that's probably plowing pieces of farm equipment. We have no European goods at Edwards or this Duncan site, no horse bone. They have no direct or not significant contact with Europeans. And in the 1500s, you're talking about Coronado probably. So he didn't make it to this site or the other one. So that's why he didn't report fortifications in this area. So we have a really neat site with a well-defined fort structure that we can see without even doing much excavations. Now, we don't know what's going on in interior of the site very much, but there's a lot of activity from the excavations we've done south and west of the fort, the site. There was a lot of stuff going on at this particular one. And we even have a drawing of what we think the fort might have looked like, with the stockaded entryway on the south side, narrow entryway on the fort on the north, and then a protected entryway coming into the east side. We put a stockade on here. We don't know, because this earthen embankment that was thrown up when they made the ditch has been plowed down, and we did not do enough excavation to see if we could still see post mold, but it's likely when we get to look at some of the others, we're pretty sure that most of these forts had some kind of stockade, wooden stockade constructed on it that left room for them to fire through at enemy attacks. Why were these here? Again, I think at this period and this time, they're mainly concerned about the Apache. If you have a fortification and you want to draw in people for trade and instead of conflict, they're going to come and probably not risk attacking a fortified site. And this would also maybe encourage other Wichita groups or other Caddo groups to come in and do trading too at these seasonal trade sites. Over 90% of the animal bone that's coming out of this site is bison bone. Well, actually, it's close to 95%. So that's primarily what they're doing. The bone's still on some of the shallow pits that they were using to roast. And so we know that they're primarily killing and processing bison at these sites along with the trade fairs. One other site out west, it's out in the Texas Panhandle way down here. There was a group of Wichita villages down in this area that are called the Garza Complex. These are what we call the Wheeler Complex. These are probably different subdivisions of the Wichita, like I said, that existed in different parts of Oklahoma. One site down here in the far south Texas Panhandle has a berm, a raised berm about 3 feet tall, a little more, and it's about 50 meters in diameter. This has never been plowed, and there's no indication of the ditch, but it has never been plowed to expose it. So we think this is a third protected fortification out as far further west than we've seen any of the others, but that it would fit in with that. It's only been tested a little bit. We know nothing else about the fortification at this site. So those are our earliest Wichita villages with forts in them. Note that these forts were not encircling the villages; they were within villages. So they were refuges that people would go to when under attack, that they could easily defend themselves. We're not sure in these western ones, since we haven't excavated too much in the inside except a little bit at Edwards. But there is evidence of activity inside. There's post molds and pits inside the fort at Edwards. They may have been living in there, but it's also possible that those pits and stuff are from the earlier village, and the later fort was put on top of that particular area. Okay, we're going to move up all the way to the 18th century. We don't have much evidence of any other forts in between. In the early 1700s, Wichita sites on the Arkansas River, 2 of them here just south of the border with Kansas, and the one on the verdigris were visited by French explorers and traders. And trappers and traders would come up the Arkansas River and up to verdigris and up the Arkansas to these villages and trade extensively with the Wichita groups in the early 1700s up to the 1750s. Around 1755, 1756, the French trade was cut off by a French and Indian War. In the 1750s, it was greatly reduced because New Orleans was being blockaded. And they were getting more pressure from Osage coming down into hunting into these areas. So they moved down, these groups, 2 different Wichita subdivisions moved down to these sites, the longest site in the Oklahoma and the Spanish Fort site, which we presume there's a fort at, but it's not been ever documented. So I'm going to talk about 1719, Dustanay, a Frenchman from the Missouri River area, came down, got through the Osage and came to a village. There were actually 2 villages on the verdigris rivers here There is one recorded in Kansas. We don't know where the other one was, and I'll talk briefly about that one. And then we've been working on these two sites to identify particularly about fortifications and how they were constructed at this time period and what was going on before they moved down here. So we'll talk about those, and then I'll come back to longest at the end. The Neosho Fort, unfortunately, is not well documented. We do have drawings of early sketches of as early as 1870 of what the earthworks appeared at the site. There definitely were ditches there and ramparts. There were remnants of them in the early 1900s. But unfortunately, for most of the fort area became an oil tank farm, and most of those earthworks were destroyed. This does not match quite most of the other forts that we've seen, and I suspect it has some problems. It could be a complete oval fort that for some reason you couldn't see the berms and embankments, but we probably will never know since it's been so badly destroyed. Interestingly enough, when Dustanay visited the sites, he noted horses there in 1719, which would have been pretty early. The Spanish brought horses in the 1500s to North America. So eventually they spread, they were captured or got away in the native groups. Wichita would have been one of the earliest groups, along with the Apache, to get these Spanish horses. So 1719 is a pretty nice time to get horses, but he did not note a fortification at either of the two sites he visited. So some question about this site. I feel it was a fortified site. I'm just not sure of the size of this site and the fort on it. I will note while I'm here that there is a site in the Ark City area that has a circle that's about 50 meters in diameter that's been identified, and it's at one of the sites that was visited by Oñate in 1601. And there is no indication from him of forts at that time, and he went through miles and miles of villages in that area along the Arkansas and Wood River, Walnut River, I'm sorry. But the presence of that circle has not been identified as a fort yet, but it's potential. There's others in Kansas up there. Okay, we're going back down to the Arkansas River on Oklahoma. One of the earliest sites recorded in Oklahoma is the Deer Creek site. This is the Arkansas River on the right, and it's where Deer Creek meets the Arkansas River. This is a village encampment above about 40 acres, right at the junction of the creek with the Arkansas River. And this is a 1938 aerial photo where we can see, I'm pretty sure you can see this kind of horseshoe-shaped, this is a ditch, an entrenchment or a ditch from a fortification. And this is a draw that goes down to Deer Creek, where you could access by water from the Arkansas River when it's high enough. And also there are springs down here on the banks of this creek. So you had a fort with direct access to water. And this particular area here has never been, the right side of the picture has never been plowed. This is probably the only fort that I know of that has never been disturbed by a plow. So there are actually small embankments and these ditches still present. This area is continued part of this site, but this has been plowed for 100 years to compare. So we're very fortunate. This particular site was never excavated officially. It was recorded as early as 1915 and in the 1930s. In the 1970s, when they put in Kaw Lake on the Arkansas River, which is just below this, but the lake backs up this way, they bought this site from the landowner, and it remained ever since in the Corps of Engineers. And they have not done anything to it since they acquired it in 1976. And it remained supposedly a protected site by by their standards. I have qualms with that. I'll talk about in a minute, but it's a very important site, and so it's the southern one on the Arkansas River. A mile and a half north of here is the Bryson Paddock site, which is a sister village occupied about the same time, somewhere around 1720 to 1756 or 7 when they moved to the Red River. So let's look at that a little bit. 1981 was a good year for early magnetics in Oklahoma. At that time, they did Edwards 1 out in western Oklahoma. They did magnetics on part of the fort in 1981, which this white area are ditches, and the very dark area are back dirt embankments. This is a map done in 1976 of what they could see on the surface of the unplowed fort area. The hatched lines are embankments, I believe, and these are the ditches. Yep, these are the ditches. The dark areas are ditches. It's a complex fort, but there's this horseshoe-shaped ring is what you could see on the aerial photos. These are much more subtle on the ground and not as visible on the aerial photos. This extension up on that point that goes between the river and the creek, we don't know what they're doing up there. It's never been investigated. So this site remained, other than surface collections from amateurs, it remained undisturbed and uninvestigated until 2014, when we've gone back to the site. It's grown over in dense forest. The whole plowed area and pasture is now in mostly dense forest. What we wanted to do was run magnetics on it and see what the fort looked like with new magnetic techniques. But we can't just doze down trees and stuff because the site's never been disturbed. So what we got the Corps to do was bring in one of these tree eaters that ate the trees down to mulch in a strip about 40 yards by 80 yards, something like, or 100 yards, something like that, right through the middle of the fort. You can almost see, here's an embankment and there's a ditch on this side, and then there's another embankment up here with a ditch. You can see those on the ground. When we did the magnetics up here on top, this is the ditch in the middle. This is the earthen embankments that were thrown up. Again, on this side, the ditch is in the middle, earthen embankments primarily on the inside, but some on the outside. And then it stops. So we thought that's an entryway. On our maps, the earlier maps, it continues down and makes a complete horseshoe. There's also evidence of another possible ditch here, which we saw on the maps of 1976. And all these little bumps in here and stuff, it probably indications of pits and hearths and other things. And there's a trash mound here and half of a trash mound exposed here. These are literally mounds where the garbage was piled up like we do today, and it might have started in pits or an old burned house or something, and then it became a garbage mound. And there are a number of these visible at the site still, and there are 2 of them that we tested into. We did do limited testing on these to see if this is what we thought they were. We did find a bell-shaped pit, so that's a storage pit that has a bell shape. 2 mounds were confirmed, and we dug into this ditch here to confirm what kind of ditch it was. And there's a reason for that. We'll go into it in a minute. The other site, the Bryson Paddock site, it's got about the same size. You're looking at the whole site right in here pretty much. This is the bluff. It's on a bluff high above the Arkansas River. The Arkansas River is right below it, about 70 feet, I think, down to it, 60 or 70. This area that you see in pasture here has, again, never been plowed. About not quite half of the site has been plowed for 100 years and artificially terraced over here. So this site's privately owned, but the landowners were interested in finding out about the site. In fact, he called us before he wanted to put a house on the site so that we could do work on it before he did that, which is very thoughtful for anybody that's planning just to build a house. he knew there was an archaeological site of some importance here, fortunately, from the work. There was work done at this site 1926, 1970s when the lake went in, and then in the 2000s when we went back to look for evidence of fortifications. This is a map of the site made in the 1976 work. These black areas are excavation areas in 1976. These little gray circles, those are trash mounds that were dug in 1926 when an expedition out of the Oklahoma Historical Society went to Deer Creek to obtain artifacts basically about early Wichita culture in the 1700s in northern Oklahoma. We don't know exactly where these mounds were, but from what I could tell, the map for that 26 excavation was lost. There are still some trash mounds that are not excavated that are still present, but he did 11 of them, I believe, and even in the plowed field he found some. This large block here, they excavated around a large circular house with six center posts, a central hearth with a excavation hole dug underneath, construction hole dug before the hearth was put in. In other words, they put a big post in the center of this house to help them put up a huge beehive-shaped house that's over 40 feet in diameter, one of the largest ones that's ever been excavated. Well, that is the largest one I know of that's been excavated. So this house may have been some kind of special structure, maybe for meetings or guests. And it's impressive that they were able to excavate most of that house. You will notice what's missing from this site is any indication of a fortification. So why have we come here? Well, one reason we came back is this site is sister to the Deer Creek sites, which we know there appeared to be a fortification there for a long time. So what happened at Bryson Paddock? Well, we started excavations 2003 or 4 in the pasture and the plowed field. Archaeological deposits, cultural deposits aren't very deep. This is about the depth of them. So when you get down to this depth, you're going to see post holes or pits that are dug down into it, storage pits and stuff. So you can get an indication of activities like house construction and features that were used for storage and arbors and things like that. But there was no fortification. And if you're, just to make note, this rise up here above where we're excavating is where that big house was excavated in the 70s. So we were able to determine, all kinds of activity areas at the site. I'm going to go through some of the artifacts just to show you what kind of materials come out of a post-contact period site in the 1700s. They're still using chipstone tools for many of their tools. The arrowheads are often made out of chipstone. You do get metal points made out of iron and sometimes brass. This material is a local called Kay County or Florence chert. There are quarries for this chert within 5 miles of the site, and it was used extensively. We have pipes. This is a piece of that red catlinite pipe that I talked about before from Minnesota, or some of it could have come from northeast Kansas, but they made clay pipes too. Metal was prominent. These are handles for kettles, but they probably didn't use the kettles too often. They used native pottery. Many of the kettles were made into tinklers, which go on clothing and other tools. They made distinctive scrapers because one of the things they were doing to trade with the French was bison hunting and hide processing. So the French coming up from New Orleans up the Mississippi to the Arkansas River and up to north central Oklahoma was to trade with Wichita for a variety of goods, but bison hides and meat were probably one of the main things. If you are working at the Bryson Paddock site, these very large hand scrapers are everywhere. If you've dug at Bryson Paddock on one of the field schools or something, and you didn't find a scraper, you weren't digging much. This was just indicates the extent of the hide trade that was going on. They were extensively processing hides and bison meat for the French traders and other materials. Here's some more of the ornaments. These are the tinklers that I was talking about. Some of these were later traded by the French to the native groups, but the Wichita, we found preforms for rolled tinklers at the site, and we think they're making their own at this time period. Probably one of the most popular tools was the metal knife. These flint knives, which are really common, especially when you have bison butchering and that kind of stuff, are extremely rare at Deer Creek and Bryson Paddock. They have gone almost exclusively to the metal knives now, different styles of knife. And an interesting tool that we see is scissors, a tool that they had no access to before. We see those frequently. And of course, guns. The French had no qualms about trading guns and ammunition and black powder to the various Indian groups, and Bryson Paddock and Deer Creek are no exceptions. These are gun barrels from rifles. You also get occasionally pistols. Most of these barrels have been modified after they became useless and used as wedges or pries and other things. The metal was highly valuable at that time, and anything they could use it, repurpose it for, they did. Wichita, though, continued to, like I said, make their own pottery. It's usually a plain or lightly decorated pot. Utilitarian ware for cooking. Metal pots, we have indications of them, but they're usually in small pieces. Now, they may have used metal pots for a while and then used the metal for something else, but the pottery remains common at these sites that they can make their own pottery. They preferred to use the metal from the kettles for other ornaments and other tools. And here's some more of the red catlinite pipes on the left, and all but the stem end of a elbow-shaped clay pipe. The clay pipe on the right is the most common pipe we see. Stone pipes are usually of trade material like this catlinite from Minnesota. Okay, we talked about why we came to see why there wasn't a fort here. In the pasture, the big pasture, as soon as we got there, we saw this ditch. Now, it's true, it's coming from uphill, downhill, but it looks like it's built up a little bit on both sides, like somebody dug and took dirt out of it. But this trench, the plowed field starts right up here, so you can't see anything north of there. So we're coming south, and then the trench makes a turn here. Most ditches that are drainage ditches would just come relatively straight downhill. So we had a clue that we're actually looking at a fort here, or part of a fort in a plowed field that is undisturbed. Most of the fort goes north and west into the plowed areas, but a significant part of it is in unplowed. So we had another opportunity to look for a fort pattern at the Bryson Paddock site. This site has probably been the most extensively examined by geophysical techniques. That means magnetic surveys, subsurface radar surveys, electrical resistivity surveys. We've done quite a few at this site, as you'll see. I'll give you a coverage of it in a minute. But this is a group from Texas who volunteered to run their proton magnetometer system over quite a bit of our Bryson Paddock site. And this is the ditch areas right in here. So they're doing the field where the ditch is visible right here in 2005. And we eventually got our own handheld magnetic units at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, and we're able to do much more area with these handheld units. So again, we're one of the better covered sites in terms of looking under what's under the ground with remote sensing. This is a map of Bryson Paddock with the magnetic areas. All these gray things are where we've done magnetic surveys over the site. This is the area in the pasture that the big ditch shows up coming down here. This is the big plowed field, and this is a plowed field. We have done very little in this area. We did one at the far north end. This slopes down to the bluff edge. The soil is probably really shallow down here, but it would be interesting to do more magnetics up here. We do have the landowner's new house was put in here after we did some excavations in here, but a septic is out here and some other stuff that could interfere with it. These here that you can see on these from the distance on these are artificial terraces dug on the slope of the field, the plowed field. We're going to take a look at this a little closer. This is that area again. Here's the trench the ditch you can see in the plowed field making that turn. These big black spikes, these are metal. These biggest ones are from telephone pole guy wires. These metal are from, could be gun parts. Several of these, there were a couple of test excavations in here in the 1970 work, and they probably left nails or something else in the excavations. But we do get metal, obviously, and iron gun parts and other things at site, so they could be that. But this is definitely screws up the magnetics up here. But I wanted to, we're talking about down here on the site in the pasture. This is the edge of the site, and the limestone bedrock is not far below the surface, so I think we're seeing some magnetic signature. This is a trash mound that's still present, was tested in the 1970s, but that's why we have that blue. The blue color has the highest magnetic, so it's colorized in this image just to show it contrasts better. I'm going to go one more picture to get it closer. So what we found when we close up to the area of the ditches, here's the big trench. Here's another ditch. Here's a third ditch. Here's a fourth ditch. None after that. And there's a break in this ditch right here that looks like an entryway. So we set in an excavation trench across here to see if there was, if these were all, what kind of ditches they were, if they're all what they seem like. These three are all moat type ditches. This is that an interior ditch is wide, much wider than that, a little bit deeper, flat bottomed, and it's characterized by having post holes in the bottom of it. We think this is this part of a structure ditch similar to that was described by at the longest site as a subterranean apartment. It's a ditch actually that was dug, dirt piled up on the sides, and then roofed over by putting posts down from the floor of the excavation. And I'll show you that in a minute. But this is actually really good, showing up. This is the telephone pole guy wires again, showing up the contrast between the ditch and the high blue, which is the back dirt from making these ditches. And notice it's usually on the inside of the ditches that we see, especially the outer one that we're seeing most of the soil piled up to make a defensive parapet inside of the ditches. So we're outside the fort on the right. It's about 150 meters, so about 170 yards to the edge of the bluff above the Arkansas River, facing east. And then the inside of this is this whole fort. I'll show you is probably 100 by 120 meters from the outside to across, or up and down, north south. This little map down here shows the excavations where this ditch ends and it picks up again, and sure enough, it ends and it picks up. They're offset or baffled so that you could put a fence up or some kind of thing here and make attackers come around and be open to fire to get into the fort. So it's a way of protecting the interior entryway. And it's not at all clear that these entryway, it does not go through the interior ditch. There's some disturbance in here. It's hard to tell. But it appears like you could come into the fort so far, then you would have to go somewhere else to get into the next layer. So they had offset entryway. This is another picture of the magnetics down there, but it's not clear enough to. Okay, so the magnetics in the north plowed field, that's this area up here. I think you can see these lines on here. Those are ditches. And there's one that comes around here. Around here. There's one that comes around here, less clear. And then there's some up here. We hit a ditch here and here. We excavated a big area in a ditch here, and I'll get to that. These areas out here, we took off the plow zone and just looked to see if these were actual ditches, and they were. And here's what they show up. We have a kind of reddish brown subsoil. When you get in the ditch, it's filled with mixed dark soils and backfill. This is a pit that was dug after this part of the pit, the ditch had been filled up. We found I'm going to go back one. We tested all three areas, and there's 3 ditches out here, and then this one that's inner ditch. They are not clear all the way around, but they probably do. There's a lot of magnetic stuff going on here that's erasing it from our magnetics. So it's not as good as the Duncan site, but we had clear evidence of a complex fort. This is a profile. You can see the dark soil comes down and goes up. This is a moat type ditch, one of the outer ditches. It has the profile here. There are 3 of these at the site, 3 most, and they're all trash filled. So part of that may be when they were plowed, but part of it may be that they were filling these ditches with trash, and over time they either had to expand their fort or wanted more protection by adding additional ditches on and ramparts as they went. Okay, the inner ditch is the different one that I've told you about. It has the wide bottom. We don't have one excavated square in here, but you can see the edges, straightish edges that go up. And in the bottom, this is a big post hole at the edge of one of the ditches. This is another post hole that was dug from the floor of the ditch, which is here, down almost 3 feet below the floor of the ditch. They were putting considerable size posts in here to support a roof over this ditch. And they were all dug from the 3 feet down. They were dug from the floor, which is about 3 feet below the surface in this area. Not only that, we see charred wood. This is a piece of partially charred oak, actually, and we see charred floor wood on charred surfaces on the bottom of the floor. And the topper this is a profile of half of a basin pits. They dug a shallow basin, and this is a hearth, ash-filled hearth that's still filled in at the bottom of the ditch. It's this hearth right here. The white areas on this are the outlines of the pit. The dark is the ground surface outside the trench. This is a good section that we were able to excavate with all the post holes that we found in the bottom of the ditch. There's a slight break in this ditch, just enough this ditch, it continues, and not far south of here, it would have been you would have been in that ditch that's visible in the unplowed field. This part of the ditch is extremely unusual. This is roughly the shape of a circular above ground structure, a beehive, grass thatched house for the Wichita, with 4 center posts and a central hearth. But this is dug down 3 feet into the ground, like the trench, and it attaches to the trench. Never seen a structure like this at another site. This may have been some kind of specialized activity area structure for a group. Obviously, its interpretation's still up in the air. This is interesting because this is a pit that was dug after this area, whole thing was filled in. So they were still at the site after this big ditch got filled in and this pit was dug. I don't have an explanation, but it's intriguing that you have basically a house type structure that's underground. So an underground apartment is not a bad description for some of this. If the activities include like house type structures, these would have been deep enough that you could stand here and look and pull the thatch apart and look out, or even fire out. And there's descriptions of that in the historic period. That's very brief, but I'll mention that at the end. What do we have at Bryson Paddock then? This yellow one is the interior structure ditch. It's quite large. We're not sure where it goes through the woods here, but we're pretty sure almost all of this. This is where we excavated a big section of it. We also crossed it right here, just to make sure. We picked up the water line on the magnetics that goes to the modern house. We picked up all these ditches that we dug on the surface. All these three ditches that are moat type ditches and the interior structure ditches were at least filled in or partially filled in during occupation of the site. Our big question is there another fort at the site since they were still living there when these were filled in? Is there another one that's outside this that makes a bigger fort? There's also slight evidence on aerial photographs that there might have been one that encircled much of the site. Again, this is in the center of a village site, so it's quite a complex structure, much different than the earliest ones we saw at Duncan and Bryson Paddock. So what we've got at Bryson Paddock, Deer Creek, and other sites that are in the 1700s, increasingly complex forts with multiple ditches, long-term occupations or reoccupations, at least two entrances to most forts. We think this draw that goes down through the village, it starts in the center of the site right about here. It's a dry draw, but it probably was also used as an entry. We don't know where other entry, or our magnetics are not good enough like at Duncan to know if there's other entryways. There probably are. Stockades, we think were present at all of the sites, but aren't well documented. We think they were used that baffled entryway like we saw at Bryson Paddock and at Duncan and other sites to guard entryways. And they may have used gates and kind of a labyrinth, what we call a labyrinth type entryway, where you have to come in one area, move vertically or horizontally another way, and get to different entrances. So really a well-constructed complex. Took a lot of effort, but it was probably well worth it to protect themselves. Again, these sites were more open to attack by Osage, but also Apache and later Comanche groups by the 1700s were out in western Oklahoma. And then I want to go back to Deer Creek real quick. This is the interior structure ditch. This is the profile of that ditch. It's the same as the interior structure ditch at Bryson Paddock. There were two post molds in this small section that we excavated, and it was also filled with trash. So the big wide ditch that's at Deer Creek is a covered structure, one of those apartments that the Spanish described at the longest sites. Back to the longest site. If you want to know what it looked like, if we wanted to know what the structure looked like that was described at longest, you got to go down there and see what it looks like. Longest is very sandy soils. We did magnetics, which I'll show you in a minute. We found out where we think the structure ditch and other ditches were. This is the edge of a structure ditch. It has a step down. You could step up here actually and fire out through the roof cover. This is the only post mold we found in this particular one, but there's post mold in it. It extended actually wider than the ditches at Bryson Paddock and Deer Creek. And when we got it had fill in it from sand, not too many artifact fills, but the very bottom of the structure had burned flooring, burned charcoal and wood on the bottom, and burning of the soil on the bottom when the roof burned, and when this structure collapsed at one point and was destroyed. So what we found at longest, this is the magnetic field, original magnetics. This particular area in here is a problem. It's 1900s homestead, probably, with lots of metal that messed up our entryway. North is up, the river's to the west, to the left, and these are the ditches we found with the magnetics, excluding that area. When we go down here to this area, we excavated across 3 ditches. The outer one is a moat type ditch like we see at the other sites. This one's a relatively shallow ditch, and we think they were building up the parapet here behind this ditch to make a higher fortification. And then the third one is another part of that same structure ditch. So we tested it here, and we found actually one post mold in this area. The neat thing is we could trace this ditch around to an entryway that went right through here. It's hard to see the north side of that, but it's right there. This entryway penetrates into the interior of the fort. So this particular entryway went straight into the fort. It's on the southeast side. The entryway described by the Spanish would have come off the west side of it and come down the bluff to the west of the, again, it's a high terrace that it sits above the river, and you have to go down about 30 or 40 feet slope on a terrace, but there are springs on that slope that one of the entryways may have gone through. Unfortunately, we could not see that in our magnetics. So we have very good evidence now from the original site that what we're seeing at Bryson Paddock and Deer Creek are structure ditches that are what the Spanish called apartments. And finally, when we looked at later in the historic record, there's a little bit of evidence. I mentioned the longest, there was probably a fort at Spanish fort in this area, the Spanish fort town. There's a Waco village. There was a Waco village where Waco, Texas is, and there's a fort described in that, which was attacked by the Cherokee that Waco site was attacked by the Cherokee in 1830. And they describe a linear ditch, which the Wichita fled to instead of a circular ditch, but they fired out from that roof of that ditch and were able to survive what could have been a massacre by a surprise attack by the Cherokee in the 1830s. Eventually, other Wichita groups came and chased the Cherokee away. So that site, unfortunately, in Waco has not been discovered or not been documented, if it still exists. And there are slight indications of some other fortifications from travelers in Texas in the 1800s up to probably at least 1850, including a site that there could have been a fort in the Fort Sill area of Oklahoma. There were 2 sites that reported that looked like they had earthworks from them. Neither of those sites has been identified down near Fort Sill. Whether they still can be found, I don't know. But basically, that's your summary of Wichita archaeology on Wichita forts in primarily Oklahoma. There's a lot of people that worked on this. It's not all my doings, but it takes a lot of people to do much research and a lot of cooperation between different people and different groups. And I appreciate having the opportunity to study these over the years. And I appreciate your interest in them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. And thank you to our audience, everyone who attended.